From Immersive Labs, this is Cyber Humanity. Hello everyone, I'm Chris Pace, and as usual I'm joined by Paul Bentham, who today is overtired, just so you know.
Hello!
Tough day.
Not that bad.
Bit moany, bit grumpy. And
it's unnecessary.
Would somebody introduce me, please?
And Kev, don't call me Kevin. Breen. Thanks for being here, both.
He didn't say hello.
He did.
He said he complained about not being introduced.
He's always interrupting me,
So
saying,
needy.
introduce me, I'm important.
Me.
Every episode.
Every episode begins with Kev trying to get a word in.
And not being allowed one.
You were having many words.
Hello.
Hello. Okay. In these short podcasts, we aim to focus on the human side of cybersecurity with a bit of tech thrown in. Social engineering, hacker motivations, all that kind of stuff. This week, we're going to take a closer look at the relationship between the media, mainstream or otherwise, and cybersecurity, vulnerabilities, threats, and attacks. We're going to talk about some of the triumphs of hype. I'm sure you all have your own examples. Classic fear-mongering, and just full-on marketing nonsense. What is it about our industry that makes us so susceptible to nonsense in the media?
A lot of vendors.
Well, yeah, because every vendor has a PR agency, and obviously that PR agency's job is to get their vendor in the news. So any dross that someone in that company comes up with will end up
It's exciting.
out there.
It's exciting, isn't it? It writes good copy. Nobody wants to be like boring cyber news. So we hype it up.
Well, there is no such, in some ways, there's no such thing as boring cyber news, because every time someone writes about a cyber threat, it's always like absolutely world-ending.
Hey, I had a great idea.
Oh, God.
I had a great idea. It's a really
I'm
great idea.
terrified.
I'm telling you, it's a great idea. What we could do is we could try and educate some of our listeners, and me mainly, by playing a game.
A game?
Yeah, a game. And I've got whole new sound effects just for this game.
Are we supposed to be acting like we didn't know this was coming?
Yes,
I
please.
am colour me surprised. A game?
Really? A game? This sounds thrilling. Let's carry on
I'm
with
excited.
that.
It's
This
a
thing that
game.
we didn't discuss before we decided to record the podcast.
I even have branded it.
Now this I
no.
wasn't
Are
aware
you
of.
didn't know this.
This could go anywhere.
Are you ready? I'm going to call
Yes.
it hype
Yeah, good.
or hacked.
Oh, in a way, even
Uh-huh.
on your own, you're sort of hyping
My
cybersecurity.
game. Yeah, no. Okay, so here's the game, right?
All
I'm
right.
going to read out one of the a famous exploit or vulnerability from the last few years. You guys, fastest finger first. Maybe put your hand up or something like that.
That's going to work brilliantly for radio.
Yeah, we should have invested in buzzers. I'm the only one with sound effects.
Yeah, well, I don't know if other people realise, but Paul does control everything. Everything technical to do with the podcast, Paul is in control of, which is terrifying all on its own, but there's some insight for you.
There you go. There's some insight. But so I have new sound effects, and this game I'm going to read out one of the vulnerabilities. You guys are going to raise your hand or shout out, and I'll use one of my sound effects to tell you whether you're right.
Okay.
And luckily, Kev knows all of it. So Chris, you're on your back foot here.
Just an interesting side note is that this is subjective. So this is...
Oh,
There's a
like
caveat
legal
coming,
T's and
there's a
C's.
caveat
Here
coming.
comes a small print.
No. So here is an opportunity for us to discuss another aspect of our industry, is that everyone is an insufferable pedant. So Kev is basically worried that he will say something. He will say, this wasn't a big deal, nobody cared about it. And then all of Twitter will be aflame with people saying, Kev Breen doesn't know anything about vulnerabilities. Kev Breen's an idiot. So now Kev gets to caveat what he's about to say. For all those people that might be about to be aflame on Twitter, Kev is now going to cover his ass.
Self-preservation.
Go. That.
Yes. Well, so like... It's very subjective. So what is not important for me might be important for your organization. What's important for your organization, I might not care about. It depends on who you are and what you've got.
I think what we're saying is, if a software vendor says, or a security researcher says, a piece of software is vulnerable to a thing, I mean, it is ultimately vulnerable. There is no one is arguing against that. Then the next question is, how vulnerable is
Can we just do my game?
Yes, all right.
This
You
is
want to
so
do the
boring.
I'm talking about security, so boring.
Boring. Right, here we go then. Right. Vulnerability number 1.
Okay.
Drown. Oh,
Okay.
Kevin. Yes, Kevin.
Can he answer and then I can say whether I think he's right or not?
When can I use my sound effects?
Well,
That's the most important thing.
When I have...
Okay.
Whoever goes second...
This game's not really going to work. Anyway, come on, Kev.
Has everybody noticed how little I've said in this podcast?
Oh, God. Jeez, me.
This was meh.
Oh, I thought Kev was going to say like hacked or hype.
Yeah, you're supposed to say hacked or hype.
Do you mean hype then?
Hype.
Hype. Ah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was hype. Kev.
Drown. Hang on. Drown.
This
was the one. Oh, I remember this. This was the one where they did see. Now, unfortunately for our listeners, I'm now in my element because this is branding and marketing.
Oh, no. King of hype
this
and the king of hacked. This is what I should have introduced. Oh, no. I should have thought about this beforehand.
So this had a great bit of marketing. It had a padlock that was like a watery padlock. I remember that very specifically. And I do remember also that they did a very clever thing which got them tons of press, which is where they said, here's the percentage of websites in the world that are vulnerable to this attack. And the media absolutely lit up because they were like, oh, turns out that, I don't know, whatever percentage of the world's websites are all vulnerable to this. And yeah, it went crazy. So you're basically saying that after all of that, all those vulnerable websites and all that fuss, it was basically a little bit of nothing.
So the website's definitely vulnerable. The reason I say it's more hype than hack is because in order to actually abuse this, you had to be like man in the middle. You had to have some kind of other network compromise. You had to be able to intercept that. So in terms of how impactful that was, yeah, meh.
So you're basically saying is we've talked about this previously. It's one of those things where if you don't already have access, there's not much you can do.
Yes.
All right.
Excellent. Good. Right. The next one. Heartbleed. Chris.
I think it was pretty bad.
Ah.
Hey.
Can somebody get one wrong? I've got a really great wrong sound effect.
So I seem to remember.
Chris? Come on, yeah,
well,
why?
I seem to remember this was. SSL. Is this an SSL thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so because SSL is so ubiquitous, because it's like everywhere, then I'm guessing that's why it was exploited a lot. I mean, yeah, that's my. I don't know the answer. That's my theory. I guessed, basically, is what I'm saying.
50-50.
For a guess, it's fairly accurate. So Heartbleed was a vulnerability in the OpenSSL crypto library, which is used across not just websites, but like SMTP servers, mail servers, and that kind of thing. And what it did is it allowed you to leak data. So you could send a request and you could get more than your response back. So you could potentially steal private keys and other things that would allow you to do further attacks and do further damage. And it wasn't long before the community actually managed to do it. It took thousands of requests. It was a very, very noisy attack, but it was fairly useful and fairly good at delivering.
Awesome. Right. Next up, it's Image Tragic. Chris.
I think Image Tragic was not a widely... Because I seem to remember there's a bit of software called Image Magic, and I think it wasn't a widely used bit of software. So I'm going to say that it wasn't that bad.
So you're saying hype?
Hype. Oh, bull.
Yeah, you got it wrong.
So, I mean, you're right. It was Image Magic. It's a library that does image manipulation, but it was very widespread.
Oh, there's where
proper
I was wrong.
hacking.
Okay, yeah.
Proper hacking.
It was used everywhere, and it was really, really easy to abuse.
Okay, next up, Shellshock. Shellshock, come on. Who's going to go? Hype or hacked? Kev.
Yeah, it was hack.
Yeah, it's a very bad one, this one. Come on, Kev, why was this bad?
Shellshock was bad because it affected pretty much every Linux environment, anything that was running Bash.
Was it a Bash? Yeah, a Bash exploit, I remember, yeah.
We'll talk about Bash because I don't really know what Bash is, and I hear people talking about it all the time. And I stay quiet and nod my head like you're meant to, but tell me what it's about.
You're familiar with cmd.exe on Windows?
Yes.
Bash
Not an idiot.
CMD. emt.exe.
Bash is like a Linux equivalent, so it's your command line interpreter,
Oh,
and
okay.
there are several variants. You've got
What does it stand
sh,
for?
bash, ash, born again shell.
Whee.
Was that was that a trick question? I felt like I was being trapped there.
Other shells are available.
Yes, this was a bug in Bash where you could get it to execute other commands that it necessarily shouldn't have been running. And again, you didn't have to do a lot. SMTP servers were vulnerable to this, mail servers. You could put it in headers. There's lots of places where you could abuse this.
Nice. Okay.
Gotcha.
Next up, Poodle.
I don't know. I'll guess though.
Yeah, come on.
I'm gonna say it was bad. I'm gonna say it was. Oh.
Wrong. Wrong
Oh,
again.
actually, good job we're not doing scores here.
You're like
I'm
the
not
fool
doing very
guy.
well. I know.
Poodle and I want to say padding oracle attack. Again, it was one of those. It was SSL, HTTPS kind of stuff. And again, it was one of those where if you didn't sit in the middle of that network, if you didn't have that kind of privileged access to be able to intercept communications, there wasn't a lot you're going to be doing with this. So yes, it was bad. Yes, you needed to patch, but how easy was it for an attacker to make use of?
Should we come back to this quiz later and cover some of the topics, or should we keep going? I've got a few more.
Oh, you got more.
More.
Oh, it's almost like you've done preparation for this.
Yeah, I thought I'd try prepping for one of these podcasts.
How's that
Just this
Just
one.
one.
How's that working out for you?
I don't know. I kind of like the spontaneity of the other ones. I can do another one. Would you want me to do another one?
No, let's talk. Yeah, let's have a brief break and we'll come back to the quiz because the quiz has
I've
been
still
fun.
got the
Okay, I'll
sound
give you some
effects.
credit.
Yes!
The quiz has been fun. You may do it this time, but let's not. I feel like I spent the whole time just reining you in a little bit. So yeah, let's take a break from the quiz. And instead, I just want to talk about two just generally outrageous. One is media coverage specific, and the other is just a bit of barefaced marketing hype that we'll also talk about. My personal favourite when it comes to media misreporting and cybersecurity is the tiny Chinese spy chips in Amazon and Apple data centers. And this was a story, and it wasn't just like it was a story like some random security journo thought, oh, I can write a couple of paragraphs about that. This was like a Bloomberg long form, one of these deeply serious, in-depth, they even boasted about the number of people who they interviewed for this thing. Like they interviewed 100 people or something. And it turned out it was all just it seems like it was all just utter rubbish. So the suggestion was that China was selling, I want to say motherboards.
Super Micro, wasn't it?
Yeah, Super Micro. Selling motherboards to companies like Amazon and Apple, and I think, in fact, even Bloomberg themselves, which I thought was really entertaining. And on those motherboards were these tiny, tiny chips that could, I don't know, like listen to everything that you were saying or track everything that you were doing or something like that.
I think it hooked into something like the BMI. So it's one of the backdoor, the standard, not a backdoor. So it was a backdoor, but it hooked into one of the systems that was supposed to enable like remote access, remote configuration, I think.
The thing about this is a great film. I mean, if you wanted to compromise national security, because the claim wasn't the claim that these motherboards had got into the servers in Apple, Google, Facebook, the National Security Agency, etc., etc.
Yeah. The implication is that it's like a supply chain hack, and of course it's not like anyone was saying that they weren't saying that was completely impossible. It's plausible,
totally
plausible in many ways,
Yeah.
but just not true in this case.
The nice thing is that, so yes, the Bloomberg article, like Amazon and Google, and they all came out and went, yeah, no, that's not true. But a researcher actually went and replicated it. So they actually managed to design a chip and were able to hide a chip that did what this thing was reported to have done. I don't think they got the form factor down as small, but they were able to replicate the actual.
Of course they did. Someone in cybersecurity thought, hang on, everyone is saying this isn't possible. I will now prove that it's completely possible for no real reason.
What I don't understand, how do you get the data out, right? So you got this thing on the motherboard, it's a backdoor, like on-board backdoor. How are you getting the data
Paul,
out?
if you go and read the article, there's a brilliant infographic.
Ooh.
Yes,
If it's in an infographic, it's got to be true, right?
Exactly, which shows you step by step exactly how it works. I think one of the problems is when we're thinking about these kinds of stories, and actually what happened in this case was it feels like the wool got pulled over the eyes of the reporter a little bit, and because the reporter is not an expert, all the reporter is looking to do is to find enough sources to be able to say, oh, this could be a legitimate story, and of course the problem is when you're trying to find facts amongst stuff that is a little bit scientific or harder to understand, there is a risk that you just kind of head to the lowest common denominator. I think that often journalists use justifications like, the near truth is an easier thing for a reader to understand. But if no one can figure out what's supposed to have happened, there is an issue with the journalism.
Do you think our industry is going to start to suffer from like too much crying wolf then?
It's already there.
You think it's already here?
Yeah, I mean, if we think about, your quiz was a bit of fun, but the reality is that those branded vulnerabilities, first of all, let's think about why do they exist. Why do we think someone brands a vulnerability?
To sell firewalls.
Yeah, because you want to sell a firewall, or you want to sell you want to sell your red teaming service. Like security researchers want to find ways to make themselves look relevant to the industry in which they work, and so that's where branded vulnerabilities come from. And so
they are a bit more interesting than calling them CVE 2020 1 2 3 4.
Part of the problem, isn't it? That's part of the challenge.
One of the challenges is that it's typically down to the discoverer to name it, but it's not always that way. So sometimes something will come out and somebody else will name it on your behalf, and then somebody else will name it something different, and somebody else will name it something different.
Now, this is great because this gives me an excuse to talk about naming conventions. I don't know if you know, but I've got a bit of a bee in my bonnet about naming conventions. Have we covered this? Have we covered naming conventions already?
We did, yeah.
So there's a number of weird things around naming conventions in cybersecurity. One is that it used to be that the person who got, sometimes if it's an exploit, it's the person who gets to it first, or malware, it's the person who gets to it first who gets to name it. But the problem is that any other vendor, if they're detecting it, for example, in a rule or whatever, they can then give it their own name. So that all becomes really confusing. And don't even get me started on threat actors. Now, threat actors are like a whole nother thing.
Fancy bear.
Fancy Bear or APT, whatever it is, and you don't know because everything's got like 4 different names. There's a Google sheet that's accessible to anyone for free that basically has to do the job now of kind of de-obfuscating all of these different threat actor groups because none of us know what they are.
It's the Rosetta Stone of APT names.
It's just
good rant.
It's crazy, and I think actually the point is really the expectation on somebody working in security day to day to be able to do all this translation at the same time as doing their job, and then hopefully not being distracted by whatever the latest branded vulnerability is potentially, I don't want to overstate it and I don't want to seem hypey about it, but doesn't that potentially increase risk?
I think it makes our life easier.
It
just makes our life easier. All we have to do is worry about the ones that are on the BBC News, right? That's the only ones that are going to hurt us, right, Kev?
Yeah.
Your quiz just proved that that's completely untrue.
And there's a couple more. So things like Curveball.
Don't use that as in my quiz.
Oh, sorry.
Can't talk about that.
Should we go back to my quiz? Yeah. The second half of the quiz.
Curveball,
okay.
then.
No, it's not. No. Okay, you can do curveball. Curveball. Who's going to go first?
I'll let Chris decide what he thinks because I know what I think.
This is recent. So I am going to say that it's hype.
I'm going to have to press this button. But also...
So it's one or
because
t'other.
it all depends. And Kev's going to explain why.
if you operate in an organization that's completely dependent upon trust, then this thing is super critical to you.
Kev, don't we all work in organisations that depend completely on trust?
Not to this level. So Curveball was a misimplementation in Microsoft's checking of certificates that were used to sign websites and used to sign binaries. And if your entire infrastructure checks the validity of signed binaries and signed certificates, then absolutely, this is super critical for you. Most organizations won't do binary certificate checking of every executable that's running, and therefore this is going to be a lot less impactful for them. In the same at the same time as that one was disclosed, there was also a critical RCE in a RDP gateway.
I remember you ranting to me about this. Yes, see, this is where the whole idea for this podcast came from, is that one day I went skipping over to Kev's desk and said, hey, this curveball thing seems like a big deal, like the marketing guy that I am. And he said to me, you're an idiot. And this is why. Because there's a much more important... See, it's the classic thing. There's a much more important vulnerability over here. It doesn't have a brand.
If you're running RDP gateways on vulnerable versions, that's a lot more impactful to you than if you're not doing certificate checking on every box that's running.
But how does someone in the job day to day know that?
And that's the thing, that cutting through the media hype is incredibly difficult. You've got to, as a person in your organization, you've got to know your organization.
So it's about understanding where so knowing well enough how your technology stack works, and then understanding where the relevant vulnerabilities are at the right time.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
not getting distracted by branding.
It is a good brand though, Curveball.
Oh yeah,
I mean that's probably my favourite.
It also wasn't its first name, and I can't remember what its first name was, but it went through a couple of different names.
See, this is back to the same old problem, isn't it?
Oh dear.
This is the consultancy that we need to build, isn't it? Like de-obfuscating names of cybersecurity stuff. Are you guys with me on it? No, not even as a consult. We just build an engine.
And like the random startup name generator thing, we could do that.
Or we could just supersede everyone else's naming conventions.
Oh, we should just do our own.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That can only make things simpler.
Of course it's going to be
couldn't
better.
make it more complicated.
Our brand would be
Absolutely not.
better.
Of course, yeah. Sorry, did you remember what it was called before?
Yes, I have. Then it's going to get Chain of Fools.
Chain of Fools. That's pretty good. That's a song more than a brand, though, isn't it? It's too wordy. Curveball was better.
Curveball was better.
Right then.
And Curveball is where we ended up.
Yeah. Okay, next one. Blue Keep.
Oh.
Ooh.
I'm going to let Chris go on this one as well.
My default setting when anything's got blue in it, for obvious reasons that Paul can't talk about, is that I think it's usually bad. So I'm going to stick with I'm going to say it's bad. I'm going to say it's hacked.
Correct. It is hacked.
So it is. So Blue Keep was a really critical vulnerability. It affected a large number of devices, but it was really hard to actually make it work. You had to know things about your target operating system.
I feel like that's a bit of a common thing. Like, I think if you're looking at Heartbleed is another example where it's like, oh God, look, all these websites are vulnerable to this thing. But actually it turned out that the actual exploiting part was much, much harder. And so therefore the risk was reduced. That's the bit that it feels to me is missing from all these conversations.
So with Blue Keep, we had POCs available, or some researchers had generated it, and they released like video clips, and they said they'd done it, and then they made the decision not to release anything. And it was several months before any POC, so we knew it was exploitable, we knew there were proof of concepts, but nobody was willing to release it because of its perceived danger.
Well, that's really interesting, isn't it?
Absolutely. Then Metasploit made the decision. After several months, they had a Metasploit module.
Yep.
They released it as an alpha, and people started to pick it up and play with it and learn more about it. And then fast forward another month or so after that, and then we saw the first attack using it. Wow. And it was completely underwhelming.
So usually that whole, like the rationale around making proof of concept code or Metasploit modules available, is that at someone's discretion?
it's entirely at the discretion of whoever's discovered it.
Right.
It's their call on whether they want to release the POCs or not.
It's really interesting. I mean, that's a little bit like saying, I figured out a way to open every BMW in the world that exists, and I'm gonna, I don't know, I'm gonna like give it away to people on eBay, right? I sort of feel like I'd be in trouble for that. In the world of cybersecurity, it's like, well, I've proved that it is exploitable. I'm just going to share that with everyone. Anyone who cares can come and get hold of this exploit code. I understand that's to do with the open nature of the... I'm going to use the word community. But you know what I mean? But there is a question to be asked there about when that's a good thing to do.
And this is where we get into responsible disclosure. So me as a researcher, I find a vulnerability, I go to the vendor and go, this is pretty bad. Vendor says, you're right, let's fix that. They patch, you then wait a amount of time, and then in partnership with the vendor, you release a POC. And that works. When POCs come out sooner is when the vendor goes, well, I don't really care.
Right.
Or if the vendor isn't willing to patch, or if the vendor's being difficult and pushing it out, then releasing POCs, whilst yes, technically you are handing out a cyber weapon, you're also forcing the vendor into action.
Well, of course, the other thing I suppose is but that's all quite vendor centric. That's making that's saying that the software vendor is ultimately responsible for producing the patch, rather than the organization using that software is responsible for deploying it. Because I'm sure the gap between like announcing to POC is actually much narrower than the gap between announcing to people actually deploying the patch.
Typically, it's 30, 60, 90 days, depending on the severity.
There's way too much cyber chat and not enough quiz.
Oh,
in
quiz.
this podcast.
More quizzing.
Sorry, more quiz.
I'm going to have to get my bleep machine ready for this next one.
Oh.
I also have to point out that the product owner failed to hit his button.
Oh, you had a moment there. We'd said you were going to...
I'm not doing Curveball.
Oh, he's not doing Curveball. He doesn't think it's interesting enough.
Just wait.
Blue
Just
keep.
wait.
Blue
I'm not doing
keep.
Blue Keep either.
Oh,
Just
It's
wait.
interesting enough.
Here we go.
Okay.
Citrix. Chris Pace.
I know that it was hacked.
Well done. And Billy bonus for this one.
And now, a word from our sponsors.
That's right. We have labs on this, both the offensive and defensive labs. And Kev's going to tell us all about them.
Yes, Kevin's going to tell you all about them. So we've got two labs. So one of them's aimed at your red team. So this is all about...
Hang on, maybe you should just tell us about the exploit first. What is Citrix?
What the
Okay, so Citrix. So Citrix, they have some virtual appliances.
Nigger.
And this brings us into stuff we've talked about before. So this is like gateway SSL appliances and things of that nature which are being targeted and having vulnerabilities found in them.
Everybody uses Citrix, don't they?
Not everybody, but a
Pretty
large portion.
ubiquitous.
It is a large portion of the internet will be using this. So this is unauthenticated remote code execution. So this is like pretty much as bad as it can get in terms of like exploitable vulnerabilities. It's really easy to use and it's really, really dangerous. And it wasn't long after the announcement, after the POCs came out, that we really started to see this pick
It was
up.
super quick, wasn't it? I mean,
Really, really quick, yes.
good.
And usually, sorry, just...
Sorry,
I'm interested.
Cyber.
I'm interested in answers to these questions. I'm assuming that the exploitation of a vulnerability like that is for the purposes of deploying some bit of malware, right? So like ransomware or whatever.
Either deploying something or just giving you further access. So if you're e-crime, if you're financially motivated, then yeah, maybe dropping miners or ransomware, like just commodity stuff. If you're a nation state, then you're going to use this to get hands-on, stay quiet, stay stealth, give yourself some persistence mechanism, and then start laterally moving through their networks.
I did stay on top of this one a little bit because it had a quirky media angle. Interesting, this is what we're talking about. But it had a quirky media angle in that once the vulnerability was announced, and there were some organisations, I think, that had decided they might take their Citrix gateways down for a little while in order to fix stuff. The Dutch press was reporting that there was the potential for there to be more traffic jams because government employees in the Netherlands were being forced by Citrix to drive to work instead of staying at home and connecting through Citrix. I mean, that's a good media angle.
That is a good angle.
Yeah, it's a good angle.
Okay,
This is one of those where responsible disclosure didn't happen. Like, Citrix hadn't released any patching, there was no mitigations in place, and even the mitigations they released, it wasn't long before the community turned around and went, yeah, those mitigations don't work quite as well as you think they do.
Didn't you find something with the AWS Citrix images?
Yeah, so Citrix released AWS images, published them into the marketplace so that if you're on AWS, you can just grab one of these and spin them up really easily. Turns out there was a couple of issues with that. They were all default by vulnerable, so they were shipped in a vulnerable state. And once you actually managed to exploit the vulnerability, it was really trivial to get the root password. AWS. So AWS did a good thing in that they didn't ship it with default credentials, but they had to be able to give you the root password so you could get on. So what they did is they set the root password to be the instance ID. Seems fairly safe.
Sensible, nice and easy to use.
The administrator of the AWS account can log on and see the ID, and away we go. Unfortunately, AWS has this really nice thing called a metadata URL, where anybody who's got access can query the instance ID from the machine.
So
Therefore,
it was easy to find the password.
I use the exploit. At that point, I can then query the metadata URL, get the root password, and then just SSH in as if I was the root user account.
So the point about the password you like because it's technically interesting. What I found more interesting was that you're basically saying that having identified that this thing was vulnerable and that everyone should patch, Citrix was still providing those standard images as the vulnerable version.
Yes, and I think
what the actual?
I think it was 2 or 3 weeks after I tweeted.
2 or 3 weeks
After I tweeted AWS,
Oh
I
my
went
God.
and tried to grab another copy to run a honeypot, and turns out they'd gone and removed all those vulnerable images.
Oh, well done, Kev.
It's making the internet a safer
Kev,
place.
cyber warrior.
Cyber, not all heroes wear capes.
No, Kev actually does wear a cape now and at the weekend.
This is going in a whole other direction.
Okay, last
Last,
I'm
I'm actually disappointed this is over. This has not been a bad feature, Paul.
Thank you. Okay, so the last I'm going to do 2 in 1 because I think they're basically the same thing, but I'm probably wrong. Spectre
Oh yeah.
and Meltdown. Chris, hype or hacked?
So again, I remember these, and I think they were extremely well branded. So I'm going to say for that reason, hype. For no other reason. Hey, we just proved our whole theory.
Top branding.
Yeah, so Spectre, Meltdown, these are a couple of things. It's what they call speculative execution on CPUs.
Easy for you to say.
It really wasn't. So this is the idea that CPUs have gotten your processor in your computer has got that smart that it does things before you've even asked it to do it. And in some very specific situations and circumstances, then you could ask it to do something and then you could fetch it afterwards. So you could ask it to issue a set of commands, it would fail, but it would still have executed those so you could read them. This, again, because it's on the CPU, you must already have a high level of access onto that machine. For standard organizations, where this becomes maybe not quite so hype and maybe potentially hackable, is if you're on shared infrastructure. So if you're running hypervisors like AWS, then there's...
Yeah. This is where it was really scary. Like everybody's like, oh my God, that's the end of Amazon.
Exactly. So like if I could spin up a standard VM on AWS, then maybe I could read all of your secrets. In practice, it's significantly harder than that.
Has anybody ever exploited it?
Not to my knowledge, not outside of the POCs.
Outside the labs.
But that could be because they were so quick at actually issuing micro patches for the CPUs.
I'm going to suggest that if the bar of difficulty is such that it doesn't represent worthwhile effort when there's so many other easy unpatched vulnerabilities out there, which I think it's safe to say that there probably are. All of the other ones that we haven't mentioned during this discussion, they're probably just going to go for those.
So the really interesting piece on this is it's not software. This is hardware. It's not that easy to patch.
No.
You really heavily rely on the CPU vendors to actually roll updates out that fix this.
Okay, so I think that quiz was successful. I'm really pleased with that.
It was fun.
But there was one that I didn't use because I think it's so ridiculous, and I know that Chris has a really good rant about it. Chris, I'm gonna throw this to you.
This is so good, and I'm not.
I was there.
Time AI.
This is not. All right, so Kev's going to rant about it more than I am. I am going to give it the credit that it deserves, because what it did was it showed just how easy, from the sort of marketing vendory, venture capital, like investment side of things, just how easy it is to convince people that the thing that you're building is real. That's the first thing. But also that you could get, I don't know how much they got in investment. It's probably millions, wasn't it? You could get millions in investment to pay $115,000 to pay Black Hat to stand up in front of a room full of security professionals and say, let us talk to you about AI-driven, time-based 5D encryption.
Quasi-prime.
The discovery of quasi-prime numbers. Basically what their whole rationale was, if we throw in, literally like a lot of other vendors, I suppose, if we throw enough sort of hype at this idea, people will get on this train and we'll be able to sell them a thing that, but I'm still waiting for it to come out that it was some kind of, punked or something like that, that it was just totally invented. It is an extreme example. It is the absolute thin end of hype. But to me, it's fascinating and actually exposes some of the challenges, I think. If you think about the investment community, if you think about those organizations looking to buy security products, how much work do you have to do to make it feel like you're offering something that is a legitimate security solution in order to have someone at least potentially interested in investing in it or buying it? So yeah, we had to talk about it, and seriously, go to timeai.io. I shouldn't plug their website because they're probably getting paid per click, but there is the most amazing video of this non-existent thing doing non-existent stuff. It's brilliant.
Whatever you do, though, don't complain about them.
Oh, they're sewers.
suing.
They're sewers.
Oh, no.
Yeah, they're suing Black Hat for
Well, they're going to
pulling
sue
them.
us now as well.
And they're also suing people in the Twitter sphere who called them out for talking nonsense.
Wait, can we put
No, we're just not
allegedly?
gonna
We
put
just
any-
edit in
all of
allegedly.
that. And
Allegedly.
all of that. Allegedly. What is it? So we've talked a lot about vulnerabilities. Kev, you can have the final word on this. You have views, I'm sure. What does all this mean?
So for me, patching is really important, but you as the expert in your organization, you set your patching policy. It's not set by the news or the media.
Good work. All right. Thank you so much, both. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please do subscribe, rate, and comment wherever you get your audio content. And if you want to know more about Immersive Labs, you can find us at immersivelabs.com or follow us on Twitter at Immersive Labs UK. Until next time, from all of us, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.